Hello and welcome to the lecture 16 of Seminars in Advanced Human Resource Economics, the PhD course. This is going to be our last lecture and I'm going to make it short because we have covered enough material for the final examinations due next month. So I'm going to keep it short. I'm going to cover two papers in this lecture. From labor mobility, I'll cover I hope that I'm not butchering these names. I definitely am, but I'll give it a try. So Chiquiar and Hanson, and the title of the paper is International Migration, Self-Selection and the Distribution of Wages, Evidence from Mexico and the United States. This is from labor mobility, and the second paper, which will be, I think I'll spend maximum 10 minutes on it. This is Card and Krueger, minimum wages and employment. So this is on minimum wages and a very interesting kind of experimental study, national experiment, and different diff approach, and very interesting paper. So, but for PhD course, I think just to cover the basics of the second paper would be enough. I'm going to spend, I think this whole lecture will be 35 minutes or 30 minutes. I'm going to spend most of this time on the first paper because it empirically tests the negative selection hypothesis that we covered in our last lecture. Okay, so negative selection hypothesis, just to give you a reminder or refresh your memory, the less skilled are those most likely to migrate from countries with high returns to skill and high earning inequality to countries with low returns to skill and low earnings inequality. So basically, high dispersion of income in distribution is a common feature of developing countries, and I'm not saying that developed countries does not have that, but it's more prevalent in developing countries. So the negative selection hypothesis suggests that in countries where there are high returns to skill, people who are less skilled, they are more likely to migrate to other countries that have low returns to skill. We saw this concept with the help of some equations last time as well, with the help of some simple graphs as well. We'll briefly retouch upon some of those things in this lecture as well. So in other words, experience and education give higher rewards at home than at host countries in this scenario. When there is high return to skill, after reaching certain level of skills, somewhere in the middle, we'll see some graphs now. After that level of skills has reached, anything beyond that would not incentivize the workers to move from the home country, because they will get more returns at home as compared to the foreign country where they're moving. So developing countries usually have shortage of educated and experienced labor, which is why the wages for the educated and experienced labor are high. So this is something what we have discussed last time. This slide is just to refresh your memory. You can go back to the previous lecture and see in detail what we did there. So going to the paper, Chiquiar and Hanson 2005 start with this introductory setup to the analysis, and what I've noticed, now I'm talking apart from this paper, the concept or the story inside this paper, I'm talking about the writing style. So when you read this paper or the one mentioned here, Borjas 1987, just like Borjas' labor economics book, this is the writing style is so intuitive, and there is a lot to learn from these big names in the field of labor economics. So Borjas 1987 is an old paper, but the writing style in this paper is very, very interesting and very easy to understand. So I think, in my opinion, we should also all follow this kind of writing style. So even though I'm covering a different paper here, the analysis is based on, theoretically at least, on Borjas 1987 and 1999. So I would recommend you to read 1987 version, not version but paper of George Borjas, This will not be covered in the exams, but for your own learning, how how does good paper, how does a good paper look like? So it's a very nicely done. And this paper also is good, but Borjas 1987 is a very nicely written paper, and same goes for his book as well. Things are very easy to understand. So the paper starts with this premise where it states that in recent decades, meaning around 2004 and 5, when this paper was written, immigration has made the US labor force larger, younger, and less skilled. So larger meaning that of course they needed more labor force, so they relaxed some of the immigration policies, which resulted in influx of immigrants from different countries, and their labor force became younger because young population came from other countries to live and work in United States, and less skilled than it otherwise would have been. So this is what George Borjas tested in 1987 and 1999 as well. The idea is that people who are migrating to United States, they are less skilled. If they did not allow for large scale immigration, the skill level would be much higher. That is the hypothesis. And this is more prevalent because of the change in Immigration Act in 1965, which relaxed the long-standing country of origin restrictions, which is why many countries faced emigration from their home countries to United States for decades. Now it has been more difficult to migrate to United States than before because of this huge influx in few years. But the idea is to test whether good quality labor has been imported from other countries or it is otherwise. So in these two papers, George Borjas did that. And in these papers, George Borjas found out that there is negative selection, and there is a great incentive to migrate to US when people are below average, have below average skill levels in their home countries. So contrary to negative selection hypothesis, the countries in Western Europe, for example, where they have low returns to skill and low wage dispersion, in these countries there is a positive selection of immigrants because the people who are highly skilled, they are more likely to move to the US. And George Borjas 1987 and 1995 finds that the there is a shift between shift from immigrants coming from Europe to Asia and Latin America, which is why economic performance of the new immigrants has deteriorated. And this is what he tested in a series of papers on negative selection. So the recent cohorts of immigrants have lower wages than natives, and it takes longer time for their earnings to converge to the native levels. These findings counter an earlier belief that irrespective of the country of origin, immigrants have high potential for earning growth. And so he's digging deeper into the reasons why some immigrants do not do as well as the others. So that was the background for the study, why this study is conducted. In this study, how do they differ from the George Borjas studies before? They compare the wage distribution of the migrants from Mexico in United States with the ones who are similar to the immigrants and still living in the Mexico. So they compare the wage distribution of similar individuals, ones who are staying in the United States and ones who stayed in Mexico and ones who migrated to United States, to see if there is a significant wage differential, to find out if low skilled workers are more likely to migrate as compared to the high skilled workers. The data is taken from 1990 and 2000 Mexican and US population censuses. In these population censuses, there is not only information about the labor force working in Mexico and US, it's also about the migrants. So this information helps in conducting this analysis, comparing the wage distribution, skill distribution in the home country as well as the host country. So the idea is to examine who in Mexico migrates to the US and how their earnings and observable skills compared to those who remain at home. So a little bit about data. Mexico is the largest source country for US immigration, accounting for 31.3% of new arrivals in the 1990s. So this story is quite old. But in 2000, the 9.2 million Mexican immigrants in the United States were equal to 9.4% of Mexico's total population. So you can imagine about 10% of the Mexico's total population was living in the United States in 2000. So that's a big number. Over the period 1970 to 2000, emigration raised average wages in Mexico by 8%. So when a skilled worker or any type of worker moves from the home country to the other countries, if there is a shortage of labor, simple demand and supply mechanism forces the wages to rise. And this is what happened here. Between 1970 to 2000, in 30 years, 8% wages increased by 8%. Relative to the United States, Mexico has high returns to schooling and a high wage dispersion, making it an ideal candidate for to test the negative selection hypothesis. So we saw in the previous lecture that if there is a steep curve, on vertical axis we have wages, on the horizontal axis we have skills. If there is a steep line, growing positively sloped line, as compared to the flatter line in United States, then the lower skilled workers are more likely to move to the US because they earn more in US compared to in Mexico. On the contrary, if Mexico has low returns to skills and United States has high returns to skills, then the high skilled workers from Mexico will have incentive to move to the US, because the low skilled workers will be better off staying at home. So these are some of the equations. I did not write too much text around it because some of these equations we have seen multiple times during the course. So the first one is this one is for Mexico. Wage W naught is for the home country where the immigrants are from. So this earning equation, wages are the function of a constant and skill level, and this coefficient delta is reflecting the returns to skills. The second equation here is for the earning function in United States, and similar to the one above, wages, log of wages depend on skills, and like Becker's equation we can extend it by including age and experience and whatnot, but we are keeping it simple here. So these are the two basic equations where we compare earnings, because the idea is to see where the returns of education are higher. So if this is mentioned right here, if returns to skills are higher in Mexico as compared to the United States, then this will be the condition. Delta naught will be greater than delta 1. The returns to schooling or skills would be higher in Mexico as compared to the US, which is the assumption here as well, and some empirical evidence that this is also a fact. Then we also did a very simple exercise in labor mobility where we tested, where we calculated the probability in the sense of how whether a person is likely to move to another country or not. We compared the cost of migration and with the earnings in the new country as well as the earnings that are foregone in the home country, and then we came up with the if the number was positive, then we said that okay, the person should move to another country. This is something similar to that. So this is the wages that Mexican is getting in United States, what we saw here. This is wages minus cost, minus, because when we open this parenthesis, this will be minus. So earnings in the United States minus earnings in Mexico minus the cost. So this is equivalent to this equation right here. Earnings in United States minus, of course, natural log of earnings of in United States minus natural log of earnings in Mexico minus the cost. So the difference between C and pi right here is this guy right here. So C divided by W naught is the time equivalent of cost. So this is, let's say it's a big sum, and when you divide it by hourly wages, this will give you estimate of hours that are required to pay this cost. So this is the time equivalent of the cost. How many hours would an immigrant need to compensate or pay back this cost? So this is what this pi represents here. So wages in United States minus the wages in Mexico minus the cost of migration. If this whole thing is positive, then the person would migrate, otherwise not. And the cost of migration in this format, in terms of time equivalent cost of migration, we could also have an equation for this where it's not constant, it's also dependent on your skills. So highly skilled workers could face less cost of migration. There could be several reasons behind it. For example, low skilled workers are also most of the time poor, so they may have to take loan from somebody to migrate, and this could entail higher costs than the skilled workers. That's one. Plus, there are several bureaucratic procedures, several forms you have to fill, several administrative things that you have to do when you're migrating, and it's way much easier for skilled workers who have less language barrier, who have more experience with filling out forms and so on. So it is easier, relatively easier for the skilled workers, educated workers, as compared to the uneducated ones when it comes to migration cost. Remember, when we discussed migration cost in the previous lecture, we discussed that it's not only the money that goes out from your pocket, it's also the time cost, it's also the skills or whatever you have to do to migrate, anything extra additional to what you would do when you decided to stay at home. So if I decide to stay in Pakistan and keep working here, then I don't have to do anything additional to what I'm doing right now. But if I plan to move to US, and if I have to take a language course, if I have to prepare for examinations, if I have to go to different offices to get some documents, all these are extra efforts. Involves time costs, involves transportation costs, and etc. And in this paper, they also include one of the potential costs that are much higher for the low skilled workers is cost of transportation, especially when it comes to illegal migration. So in short, the illegal workers have to pay higher costs because they pay somebody to cross the border. They pay high cost for staying somewhere safe for a short period of time. Then they pay high cost for transportation from that border crossing to somewhere safe and so on. So these costs are much higher than what a normal transportation would cost. So these are also something that could be considered as extra cost for the low skilled workers. But this is more of an exception than general norm. So the other examples are more common, let's say. So this figure might look familiar to you. This is what we saw in a previous lecture as well, very similar to this one. We have two lines. This one, as you can see, this was the intercept for earning function in Mexico. You can see from the not in subscript, and this is the line for the earning function. We have natural log of wages on vertical axis and skills on horizontal axis, and this is the positively sloped straight line for the earning function in Mexico. This is the line for United States, where the earning function is not only the function of the intercept, the skills, but also it has a negative component of the migration cost. So this might scare you a bit. So why we don't have, let's see this first, and then I'll go to the previous slide to explain where this exponential term is coming from. So we don't have this point, this guy right here on left hand side, because at this point s is equal to 0. So when we put s equal to 0, this will give us the intercept value for this line, and when we put s equal to 0, this term disappears, and only thing left is mu1 minus e raised to the power mu pi. Okay, where is this mu pi coming from? This is coming from this equation right here. So if I want to get this pi from this equation, I have to take exponential on both sides. And one additional assumption these guys have taken in this paper is that this delta is the same for every country. So from wherever you are migrating, this is the same for every country, and also for every level of skill. So it's similar. In other words, we can also say that this coefficient is 0. It means that cost of migration does not depend on your skill level. So if this is an additional simplifying assumption, if you put 0 here, then this term goes away, and this is a constant, meaning, as I said before, the migration cost is constant for everybody. And since I need pi, not ln of pi, so I need to take exponential on both sides. When I take exponential of natural log, then this becomes only pi. And when I take exponential of this term right here, we get this guy right here. So this is the pi that we saw here. This is the formulation in this equation. So this is why we have a straight line, since we do not have this guy right here. So cost of migration is not dependent on skills. The few scenarios that we discussed few minutes ago, why lower skilled workers may have to pay higher wages, higher cost of migration as compared to the skilled ones. We have discussed it few minutes ago. This is the point right here. So in this first graph, this one, we have assumed that delta pi, this coefficient right here is 0. And this is what we get here, right here. So anyone who has this skill level S star or beyond that, anyone who has this S star would be indifferent between moving or not moving to US, but anyone who has more than this level of skill would be better off staying in Mexico, because the returns are higher in Mexico as compared to the US. Remember that we had this assumption that returns to skills are higher in Mexico than US. Anyone who has less skill level than S star would be better off going to the US, even after accounting for the migration cost right here, because the returns are higher in the US as compared to Mexico. So this is the simplified version of the graph. In this graph right here, we have is the similar one that we saw before. The only difference is that instead of making this guy 0 and then taking exponential, now to make this analysis more detailed, this simplifying assumption of delta pi being 0 has been lifted. It means that cost of migration is constant minus some component that is driven by the skill level. So this is not 0, it's something negative number, which means that the higher the skill level, lower will be the cost of migration. The reason we have discussed a few minutes ago. When this happens, so it says this is an exponential, so this becomes a nonlinear graph, and it varies bit with S, so higher the level of S, the higher the line in the even though it is non-linear, it is a positively sloped line, increasing with the decreasing rate because of the negative signs, of course, and everything else remains the same, because when you put 0 in place of S, it becomes the same here. This guy goes away, and this guy also goes away, so we have mu1 minus E mu pi. So this is the initial point, and then we have this curvature right here. So the different thing that they do in this paper as compared to the other papers on this topic is that they are comparing the distribution of skills in Mexico as compared to United States. So this is what we have in terms of earning functions in Mexico and United States. Now we have to differentiate between intermediate selection, positive selection, and negative selection. Negative selection would mean that lower skilled workers are have more incentive to move to US. Positive selection means that high skilled workers have more incentive to move to US, and intermediate selection would be somewhere in the middle. The people who are in the middle of the distribution would have incentive to move to the US, and this is what we are seeing here as well. But an additional dimension which is covered in this paper that we are covering right now is that when we compare the distribution of skills between Mexico and United States, then we can distinguish between positive selection and negative and intermediate selection as well. So let's take some examples. Let's say that the distribution of skills right now in Mexico has the lower end of, let's say if this is a bell-shaped curve, for example, let's simply assume that. And if this curve is starting from somewhere here, which is less than SL level of skills, and ending somewhere between SL and SU, it means that anybody who this would be the maximum point. If this is the end of the distribution of skills in Mexico, then it would mean that anybody who is at the high end of the distribution of skills would have incentive to move to the US, because they all the high skilled workers in United States fall under this bracket right here, SL and SU. Anybody who is in this range has the incentive to move to US. So US would be attracting the high end of the skill distribution in the Mexico. So this is if the distribution of skills is starting from somewhere around here and ending somewhere around here, that would mean that the people who are migrating to the US are highly skilled as compared relative to the ones who are in Mexico. So in other words, US would be attracting the cream of Mexico, because anybody who has higher skills is likely to move to the US, because even the highest level of skills, because we assume that the distribution ends around here, would have incentive to move to the US. On the contrary, if the lower end of the distribution in Mexico starts from here and the higher end ends here, somewhere around here, so it means that the distribution of skills is much on the right hand side in the Mexico, and because this if we assume that the shape of the distribution is like this, the bell-shaped curve, then anybody who is crossing this line would not migrate to the US, because this is the returns to skills. Anybody who has higher level of skills than SU would stay in Mexico, because this is the level of return they would get in Mexico as compared to what they would get in the US. So that would be negative selection, because only people who are on the left hand side of this distribution in Mexico would move to US, because only they have the incentive to move. Now the third one is intermediate selection. Of course, anything below that and anything little bit higher than that, something around here. If the distribution of skills in Mexico is somewhere around here, it means that you can also have some skills here, some skills here as well. Let's say we can draw a slightly more broader graph. Let me see if I can do that. Let me see if I can draw that. So if we have a distribution like this, for example, then anybody who is in this intermediate level would have the incentive to move to the US. That is why this is called intermediate selection. Okay. So these are the results. So there is a lot of detail in this paper. There are many different aspects that they have discussed about the data, because it's a very rich data. Interesting paper, but I don't want to go into those details. The whole purpose of discussing this paper right here is to explain the idea of negative selection and if this really happens in the real world. So I'm just covering the important bits of the paper. So these two graphs, A and B, they compare the actual earnings of the Mexican residents in 1990 as compared to the counterfactuals of the similar residents with similar skills and age groups who have emigrated to the US. So if the wage distribution is higher in the US, then these workers are more likely to move, and this is what these graphs are showing. So this is the difference between these two graphs, and this is the actual density, and you can see that anywhere in this region they are less likely to move to the US because the density of earnings is higher in this in Mexico, because this is why it is negative. And people between so anything above 0 is somewhere around here. This region right here, it reflects that these people have more incentive to move to the US. So this is in a way that would mean that these are the guys who have incentive to move, meaning that this is the intermediate selection for male in 1990s, because on the right hand side it is also close to 0, on the left hand side even it is negative. So wages are reflective of the earning potential as well. So skills are something that could be quantified, but also wages are reflective of earning potential, meaning the level of skills. This is what the distribution is also trying to convey here. This is for the females. C and D, even more evident is in case of females that somewhere around here is where it starts to get positive, and intermediate selection is quite evident right here. These parts are also higher than 0, so there is some incentive here, but the incentive is much higher in this region right here. So anywhere, somewhere in the middle or right of the middle is are more likely to move to the US when it comes to the females. So this is for counterfactual and actual earnings in 2000s, so after 10 years of what we saw in the previous graphs. And this is intermediate selection at its best. You can see that it's in the middle, and this is right skewed, so positive selection is evident here on the right hand side for women. This is for women, this is for men. So this is intermediate selection, and this is the kind of positive selection, because on the right tail this is also very close to 0. So this tells us that for male at least there is no evidence for negative selection. Either it is, in both cases combining male and female, we have evidence for positive or intermediate selection. We don't have any evidence for negative selection here, because the highly skilled workers have more incentive to move to US, and because they earn more in the US. So concluding, results are inconsistent with negative selection of Mexican immigrants. This is what we have said before. The other 2 points that are mentioned here, they are for that you have to see other tables in the paper. I'm not covering them here, but the very interesting point is that those most likely to migrate are young adults with moderately high schooling. This moderately high schooling is reflective of absence of negative selection as well. All right, so this is what was about this paper, negative selection hypothesis paper, and this concludes the labor mobility chapter. And very briefly, I will now cover the minimum wages concept and one paper on that, Card and Krueger. So, minimum wages is amount of remuneration that an employer is required to pay wage earners for the work performed during a given period, which cannot be reduced by collective agreement or an individual contract. This is International Labour Organization's definition of minimum wage. It prevents workers from exploitation. So the purpose of minimum wages is to protect workers against unduly low pay, meaning exploitation. They help ensure a just and equitable share of fruits of progress to all, and minimum living wage to all who are employed and in need of such protection. Minimum wage systems should be defined and designed in a way to supplement and reinforce other social and employment policies. Historically, the purpose of minimum wage has evolved from policy tool to be selectively in few low wage sectors as instrument of much broader coverage. So, all in all, minimum wage policy is designed to make sure that there is no exploitation. We still see exploitation even though minimum wage laws are in most countries in the world, but we see exploitation mostly in Middle East of low skilled workers. So evidence is against the benefits of minimum wages in most cases. Most cases is a big word, but in some cases, let's say. So this is what Card and Krueger did. So theory suggests that increase in minimum wages should be followed by decrease in employment by perfectly competitive employers. Firm paying more than minimum wage would either increase employment or would keep it the same. So if I'm paying already more than minimum wage, so it does not change anything if minimum wages have increased in the market, unless there is some change in the competition. But firms paying more than minimum wage already, they don't really bother with it. They should not bother with it. But Card and Krueger have tested what happens when there is a change in minimum wage laws. So they examined the impact of increase in minimum wages on in New Jersey on fast food industry in New Jersey as compared to the neighboring state, Pennsylvania. They used different approaches to see if there was some difference in different aspects of the business of fast food industry, and this is the main point of this study. So different approach is very simple. We have Pennsylvania right here, we have New Jersey right here, we have this boundary between separating the two states. Now for a different approach, what we need is similarity in all different aspects. So it might be difficult to compare New Jersey with any other state on the west side of United States, because they will be very far away from each other. There will be many different cultural aspects, geographical aspects, economic aspects, types of labor markets, types of laws that would be different, and so on and so forth. But with two states separated by simple border, we can safely assume that across these borders the characteristics are very similar. So we can safely compare the impact of something. If there is a change in fast food minimum wage law in New Jersey and there is no change in Pennsylvania, then we can safely assume that everything else is similar, at least across these borders, because people can easily travel from one place to the other. Some even live in one state and work in the other. So if there is a difference in the way they work after the changes in minimum wage laws, then it would be because of the minimum wage laws, not anything else. Anything else that changes across United States would affect these states very in the same way, because they are only separated by a boundary. They should have similar cultural values, similar labor force, they should have access to similar facilities and so on and so forth. So there should be many different types of similarities. So in a way, Pennsylvania would be the control group, New Jersey would be the treatment group, and we could see if the changes in minimum wage had any impact on the different types of business activities in fast food industry. So this is the details about minimum wage. I'm not going to read this out. Minimum wage increased in 1990, in 1992 as well. They increased it even further, and despite the opposition, the proposed change was implemented. So this is what they have found. Employment effect: increase in minimum wage increased employment instead of reducing it. So if the cost of production is increasing, stores are likely to let go of some employees, but employment increased actually in New Jersey as compared to Pennsylvania after the increase in minimum wages. Non-wage offset: following the increase in minimum wage, restaurant decreased the fringe benefits, meaning discounted prices for some of the food for their employees and so on. They reduced it. Price effect: increase in minimum wages had ambiguous effect, meaning the insignificant effect. It is in theory, when minimum wages increase, it is likely to increase prices of the products, but it did not happen, or at least it was insignificant. And store openings could potentially restrict entries. However, in this case, increase in minimum wages had no effect on store openings. So that's it about this paper, and also about this course, about this lecture as well. I know that the second paper I rushed through it, so I don't expect you to deeply understand each and every aspect of this one. But minimum wages is an important topic, but we did not have time to cover it in detail. And I think if I cover too much right now at this last moment, I think you have exams coming up very soon. I think that will be too much. So I'm not going to go in detail, but I highly recommend you to read these two papers. If you have any questions, we can have an interactive session tomorrow. I'm going to announce it in a moment, and we can discuss some of the aspects of this paper, and also anything else that is linked with the course as well. Okay, thank you very much.